Welcome to People's Daily Studio, where prominent voices from China and the world share their insights. I'm Huilan. Today we are joined by Hans van der Ven, a professor of modern Chinese history at the University of Cambridge and currently a professor at China's Peking University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. So your profile on the University of Cambridge website mentioned that you still don't have a very good answer as to why studying Chinese history has become your life passion. I wonder, do you have an answer now? And what initially sparked your interest in modern Chinese history?
I don't have an answer. I really don't. And often people ask me, sort of, why do you Chinese? And they say, well, you have a family member, did your grandparents live in China, were they missionaries, anything like that? And no, I didn't know any. When I applied to do Chinese studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, I really had no idea. I think what Chinese studies has done for me has given me an absolutely wonderful life. I've come to China regularly. I've met great people. I have great friends. And studying China is great for somebody like me, who needs to be very busy and very occupied and very active, because there is no end to what you can do, and you can concentrate on so many different things. There is language, there's culture, there's literature, history, and so I've always just, every step of the way for me in my life, from beginning it, being reasonably good at it, and getting a fellowship to study at Harvard, then coming to finding a job in Cambridge, finding great friends along the way in China, going to conferences here, meeting people, meeting their children. It's transformed my life. Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad that I don't have an answer, because it's very good not to have an answer, so I can keep going. I think, simply put, I've never wanted to do anything else. Wow. It's been absolutely, and I have been researching what is the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese trade, Chinese Maritime Customs Service, warfare. I might do something on the reform period when I'm finished with what I'm doing now. So there's so many interesting things to do. And I guess there was one moment when I first came to China, when it was the year before I finished my PhD. Am I going to like this country or not? Because if I don't like it, I've wasted 10 years of my life and I'm going to do something else. And you took the train from Hong Kong, from Canton to Beijing, and it took 3 days. And then I got to Beijing, and I saw people, and I met people, and there were so many interesting moments. Mm-hmm. From seeing somebody playing songs with the guitar, Bob Dylan songs with the guitar, to mm-hmm. going to a hotel where they were shooting The Last Emperor, the film, and all the actors were dressed up in Manchu uniforms. This is going to be just great fun, I thought. This is just so many interesting things, so many things happening. And people were excited, so I was very glad. I liked the country. Yeah, so you're still seeking the answer, but you're sure about your willingness and your passion for the culture in China. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And I've always had good luck in China. It's been, for the first time I came here, I found a lot of materials for my PhD. Mm-hmm. Then I went to the Nanjing, to the archives, and I found a huge archive. I've always found good things to do that I get really excited about. Yeah. Since you mentioned the archives, let's talk more about your academic work. Okay. Yeah, in the interview in 2019, you said that China was written out of the Second World War in the US and in the UK. So what might be the reasons for that? And why do you think those untold stories are important for the world? They are hugely important for everybody to know. I think the reasons for the lack of knowledge are understandable, and they both relate to China as well as to the US and the UK. I mean, in China, the Second World War wasn't talked about until the late 1980s, really the early 1990s. Only since the late 1980s that people here began really researching the Second World War, China's Second World War, the war of resistance against Japan. And of course that has since then taken off and has become a huge topic of discussion, debate, films and so on in this country. I think, like most countries in the United States and the UK, people talk about their Second World War. You know, the French historians talk about the French Second World War. In the US, it's their Second World War. So for the United States, their Second World War begins with Hawaii, the attack on Hawaii. For the US, for the UK, it's 1939. And to the extent that Asia is talked about, it's going to be Burma, because there was a lot of fighting with British Indian forces there. For the Dutch, it's their Second World War is in Holland and in Indonesia. So I think in China, you actually have the same. China's Second World War was all about defeating Japan. And I think the next move in understanding the Second World War is to take the idea that it was a world war far more seriously, and to not just have nationalist versions of the Second World War, but move beyond that and see how large countries, small countries, all interacted with each other. And so the project I'm now doing is writing a book about the Second World War that includes China, but also India and also Indonesia. And I think that allows me to have a more global version, to also see what happened to Indian and Chinese relations in the Second World War. You think China was ignored. Just wait until, Holland and Indonesia were completely ignored by everybody. But actually, the story of the Netherlands and the Netherlands is very important, because Japan attacked the United States and Britain because they wanted the oil from Indonesia. It's the only place that could deliver it. So what we call Pearl Harbor actually should be called the Netherlands East Indies, because that's where they wanted the oil from. So there's much more global ways of thinking about the Second World War that I hope, at least my students at Beta find it interesting to finally learn something about India, about Indonesia, because they know a lot about the Chinese history. Actually, there's a much broader context in which the China story plays out, in which Britain is active in various places. And my aim in this book is to suggest that the Second World War, in the American and in the UK explanation, and of course they're the heroes, they always think they are the heroes of the Second World War, the Second World War is about freedom, democracy, things like that. And actually, I think from an Asian perspective, it really is about dealing with Japan, of course. It's also about using Japan to achieve certain aims, as happened in Indonesia and in the Philippines. But it is also about ending imperialism. I think that goal of ending European imperialism in Asia was a goal that was shared by people in China, by people in India, by people in Indonesia. And I think that realization needs to become much more strongly that the Second World War in Asia is the aim, or the historical result, is that it began as a war for empire between Japan, between the UK, between France, between the Netherlands, but it ended as a set of independence movements that drove out European imperialism. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, the whole story, the meaning of the Second World War actually changes rather a lot. Whether people agree, that's a different matter. I can only make the case, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, you've mentioned a lot of details of history. So as a historian who was raised and educated in the West, how do you think of the significance of studying Chinese history for comprehending today's China?
It's hugely important. And I am actually very worried about the lack of knowledge in China, the lack of knowledge in the United States, in Europe, about China. And it is really very shocking. I think there are several 100,000 Chinese studying in the United States. There are thousands, tens of thousands of Chinese studying in the UK, many, many more across Europe. I think the number of American students today in China is about 300. This cannot be good for the future. And sort of when I walk around Britain, I meet people not in Chinese studies, the lack of knowledge about China is so severe that they really have no clue. And I think the problem here is that China is a great country. It's a daguo. It is going to be everywhere. It has interests everywhere, and so it should. And the lack of knowledge now is at the bottom, creates a fear of China, which is very unreasonable. It's very creative, wonderful fashion, food is terrific, and so and to know its history and where it's coming from, to know the very difficult 19th and 20th centuries, but also the Qing, the Ming dynasty, the great cultures of the Tang, the Song, and before, the great philosophy, the great literature. Forget about geopolitics. It is so rich in so many ways that we Europeans and Americans deny ourselves enormous opportunities to enrich our own lives by simply ignoring this country. So I think it's in our interest, because China is a great country and will be important in our lives, but it is also an intellectual, cultural, musical resource that if we know a little bit more about it, our own lives will be so much richer.
Yeah. So after 3 decades of career at Cambridge, you joined Peking University
Yes.
2 years ago. Can you tell us what motivated you to join the university, and how do you think this experience will enrich your career?
It has enriched me already in many ways. I wanted to do it because I wanted to work in a Chinese environment with Chinese colleagues under Chinese rules, because I thought that is something I needed to do to understand the country. And I've worked in the United States, I've worked in the UK, and doing that, you learn a lot about how a society actually works. Yes. And I've learned a lot from that. But more than that, I remember very well, as a first-year student in Leiden, I wrote a book by a scholar called Zhou Zizong. It was a book about the May 4th movement, Wu Si Yundong. And I was excited by it. I thought, this is really cool. You're really impressive. You know, what courage, what energy, what creativity. And of course he talked a lot about Peking University. And then as I went through my career, I've come to China, I know about Peking University, it's very prestigious. I know the names of the great scholars of Hu Shi, Gu Jiagang, Jianpo Zan. And, just to end my career being part of the best institute, the best department of history in China about history, it's just such an honor. It is just it just really is. And I'm really enjoying very much being part of that and being part of an institution, of a department that I truly admire. I think it's cool. There I was, 18 years old, knowing nothing, knowing no Chinese. Think, oh, this is great. The whole May 4th movement, and then ending up at that place that where they think I am whatever, I'm good enough or something, that I can work with them, and they treat me as real colleagues.
And through your interaction with scholars and students here, what are your impressions of the younger generation of Chinese people?
I think they are very different from the generation of students I met in the 1980s. And that is the generation of students with whom I've spent my career. And I've met them in conferences, I've worked with them, I've published with them, I've translated them. And they, they're friends. And they were smart, very smart. They did not have the same educational opportunities. Their secondary education wasn't as good. The universities were not as good. There was lack of money and so on. I think the students today are much better educated. Many have been abroad. They have read many of the same books that my students in Cambridge. So they're part of a global community of scholars. What I like about universities is that you have an older generation finding a place, a classroom, to have discussions with a younger generation.
Yes.
And that's the great thing about universities.
Like exchange of minds across generations.
Exactly. So there's a generational transmission.
Right.
And that's great. And of course, for people who are as old as I am, which is becoming very old, to have the privilege of working on a daily basis with very young students. I know that my friends who don't work in universities are very jealous of that.
Okay. So what are the similarities and differences between Chinese young generation and their peers in Europe?
I don't think there are many anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The students I see are largely from backgrounds where poverty was not an issue. They are part of the same debates, intellectually, the same sort of scholarship. They get taught the same things. They dress alike. They go on holidays in very similar ways. They feel the same pressures, financially, job-wise, relationships, psychological pressures, well-being pressures. So I think the differences aren't as great as they used to be. And that's a form of globalization that is good.
Since you moved to China, what new insights have you gained about this country, and what aspects of China do you find most captivating today?
I find a lot of things captivating. In the last 3 years, I've met a lot of businessmen my generation, university leaders my generation, and I've become really interested in how the reforms were actually, the 改革开放, how that was done, how that was possible. So I've these discussions with some of these businessmen who had nothing in 1977, 1978, and they went to university, and then they built these huge companies, or they had all kinds of investments, and they now talk about. So they now retired or close to retire, and they talk about their career, and I find that very interesting to see how that generation built China that we now know, and I think through them I'm beginning to understand a lot more. And become very interested in how that was, because it's such a big job, and it is such a huge story. It's unique in history, the whole sort of movement of people into the cities, the building of banks, the building of railroads, the building of the roads themselves, building of great universities. And now they talk about, how do we ensure such issues as, how do we ensure that what China has achieved now in terms of wealth, how can we make sure that is not wasted over the next generations, but is turned into a foundation for the further growth of China. And then we talk about, because they want to talk about history, so how did Britain do it in the 19th century, or how did the Netherlands do it? And I think those are really interesting topics, and I think if foreign audiences would know about how these friends of mine talk about the reforms themselves and how they achieved it, but also how they think about the issues that China now faces, which is not just China as a danger, but China needs a future, and how do you do that? What do you do? So I think they would actually find that very interesting to learn about. But it also sort of, for me, the interest is in, what are the practical aspects of rebuilding China into the Daguo, the big country, the great power that it has become now. And much of it is very practical.
Yeah, so it's like in your career, you are also refreshing your questions.
Absolutely.
Your passion
so
for
it's a
this
new
country.
question,
yeah.
right? It's a new question,
yes.
which will keep me busy for decades until
Yeah. Okay, so what else of Chinese society and culture do you hope to explore further? Like food or language? Any other things?
Not so much food. I enjoy food. I like going to banquets. I enjoy baijiu. Mao Tai is very good. Arguoto, not so much. I like the drinking, banqueting, social engagement, social relationship culture very much. That to learn more about that's very good. But I'm not really interested in food. But there are many areas of the country I haven't been. I have not been to the northeast, at Dongbei. I'd love to go to Gansu, to Neimenggu. Chongqing I've been, of course. I haven't been to Chengdu. more of the South, more of the differences. So it's a great variety of things. Other things I would love to know more about is, but I will not ever learn, I'm sure, understand, is Chinese music.
Okay.
I mean, it's so different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to know more about it, but I would need...
You mean pop music
No,
today,
no.
or classical music?
Classical music.
Oh, okay.
Pop music too, but that's less, no, but the classical music, Peking opera, or all these operas. Clearly, it's of such interest to people, or used to be.
Yeah.
And I think it might come back. But so these are aspects of Chinese culture that are still closed to me, and I'd like to see that open up.
Yeah, you could
Whether
visit Anhui for Huang Mei Xi,
Yeah.
if you haven't heard of it. Yes.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So my next question is, in recent years, there have been some discussions about the so-called globalization in reverse in light of this rapidly changing international landscape. What do you think of this phenomenon through a historical lens, and how important it is to forge global connections?
Well, first of all, there's no doubt that building more connections is important for everybody. I think one of the things that great powers, as they rise, need to do is build connections with all the places they are active. In terms of the history of globalization, it goes up and down all the time. And you have had various forms of globalization. We go back to the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols were a great force for globalization, but that, of course, collapsed again. In the late 19th century, it was a great moment of globalization across the world, led by the British Empire and French and the Dutch to an extent. But then that collapsed. And then after the 1980s, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and disintegration was another great moment. And then now it's declining. And so I think these things do go up and down. I think the concerns I have about our own age are, first of all, polarization between countries, but also within countries. We've seen it in the United States very clearly in the last election. We've seen it in the UK in the last election. We've seen it in India. And the other thing I worry about, which is very prevalent in many countries, is what you could call apocalyptic thinking, doomsday thinking. The world is going to end. Unless we win, we will die. Revolutions tend to be like that as well. You've had it in earlier periods. You've had it in Europe all the time. And people now sort of feel like this is such an important age, and unless we do the things right, the world will disappear. I think in Europe there are younger generations who think we are the last generation. And no, they're not. They won't be. It will, but I think it's very dangerous to think in that way, because it makes you do things that are extreme. And so I think we need to argue for more integration, more contact, but also for speaking about a future for which we can have more hope. There must be hope. There is hope. Human beings are, look around you, are so ingenious. Look what China has done in the last 40 years. It's such a testimony to creativity, to hard work. Many countries can do this. Of course they can. And the world is changing in such interesting ways so quickly. Why give up hope? It seems rather strange.
Yeah, we do need more courage and hope in terms of enhancing global links. We need a step further.
Look at all the new technologies. And no, the world is not going to end.
But today, as more and more people come to China, visit China, and study China, such exchanges will help build more bridges for mutual understanding between countries.
It will, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So today we touched upon the depths of history, but also we talked about some lighter cultural topics. It's a great honor talking with you today, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for sharing. Okay. This is today's PD Studio. Thank you, and see you next time.